I want to introduce a friend and a brother to you this morning who perhaps knows more about trees than anybody else in this congregation. 22 years he was the chief arborist for the city of Westbrook, and at his retirement dinner I think every major civic league and organization in Westbrook was represented, and I felt very honored to be invited to be there. And Wes McCaig, you're out here someplace. There you are, way in the back. If you go out to the Pride's Corner School, you will find a beautiful red oak tree that they planted there in honor of Wes McCaig. In fact, he has every, come on over here, he has every tree in Westbrook on his computer, still, even though he's retired from over there. But Wes, something happened to you about 5 years ago on a night shortly before Thanksgiving. Tell us about it.
Well, the day started out like any other day. You know, I went to work. When I got home that evening, I went upstairs to watch a football game and left Carol and Adolph Bowens and my daughter downstairs to whatever they do down there.
Yeah, while you watch football.
Right, yeah. But I was drinking a soft drink, and I had a difficult time swallowing. I'd take a sip, and it just didn't seem to go down. And I thought, that I was having indigestion. And so probably, that went on for a while, and I probably did the worst thing I could do. I went up and downstairs for a couple of times because I knew that I wasn't feeling the way I should be feeling. And then finally I went into the bathroom and, tried to do what I had to do. But when I come out, Carol was standing there, and by that time I was sweating real profusely and my skin was very gray. And she said, "I'm calling the rescue unit." And she did.
And she did, and they took you to Maine Medical Center. Right. What happened as you were going into the emergency room?
Well, when I went into the emergency room, just going through the doors, my heart stopped beating. And I was in the emergency room for 2.5 hours. They were working on me, and the doctor told me that they had got my heart going a couple of times. I had used the paddles, and I had 6 needles in my arm where they had given me various drugs, trying to get the thing going again. And he said, but when they did get it going again, it was very erratic, so they had to take other means to keep it going.
And you were completely out of control, weren't you? I mean, you're helpless.
That's right.
Couldn't do anything for yourself.
That's right, yeah.
And that's not typical for Wes McCaig, is it?
No, that's right. Yeah.
I can picture you climbing the pine tree up at my cabin and chainsaw and running a crew and all, and I think 15 years you never missed a day of work at over there in Westbrook. How did you handle this helplessness? I mean, treated like you couldn't do anything for yourself, could you?
Mm-hmm. Well, as far as my own life was concerned, I have no concern about whether I died or not, because I know where I'm going.
You really didn't? That's no right. Concern?
No, I never had that concern.
How do you know where you're going?
Well, because I trusted the Lord as my Savior, and I know that I've been a Christian for many, many years. And although I haven't been there all those years, the Lord has always been there.
So that part of it was okay.
That's right.
But what about the job, the work, all of those things, and just doing things for yourself? How did you handle the helplessness?
Well, I just kind of turned it over to the Lord, I guess, because it really didn't concern me that much. I knew I had a great wife, Carol, and I knew that she would take care of me. I had a lot of back pay that I knew I could keep going for a while. If I died, I knew the Lord would take care of her as well as me. But I guess my main concern was, they would have the loss, I wouldn't. Mm-hmm. And I guess I was really kind of concerned about that.
So the fact that you weren't in control still did not make you hysterical or anything like that?
No, well, I was, when they took me upstairs into ICU, I became violently ill. And they worked over me quite a while up there. And
a lot to clean up.
Yeah, and I guess you popped in about that time, so you kind of see what I look like, and I was in pretty bad shape. But I don't know, the Lord just kind of saw me through this whole thing, and I realized I was helpless, and where I was pretty much in control throughout my life, I was no longer in control. You know, it's between the Lord and my family to keep me going.
And I asked Wes, thank you, Wes. Wes told me when I asked if he'd do this, he said, well, let me pray about it. And then after a while he came in and he said, first thing he said when he came into my study was, you know, Pastor, you know, I may feel comfortable climbing trees, but I sure don't feel comfortable coming up in front of the microphone in the pulpit. But I asked Wes to do this because he demonstrates real victory in an area where, frankly, I struggle. I fear helplessness. It troubles me to be out of control. A couple of years ago, I was involved as on a search committee for the general director of one of our national organizations, and thinking that perhaps it would help us to be, you know, a better team working together. They had the whole search committee do some of these personality test evaluations, and one of the items that it checked was you know, the area of controlling and the importance of being in control. I went off the spectrum on that one, to, I guess, few people's surprise. But yeah, I am the kind of person who really wants all the ducks in line. And then I want the duck hunters in line. And with that kind of personality, you know, the fear of helplessness and the fear of loss of control is a real reality for me. Karen and I were talking before she went back to the Philippines about this, and she said, yeah, you know, she said, Daddy, you and I are kind of alike in this, that chaos makes us uncomfortable. I may cause it. I may be the source of it. But I want things in order. And so here I am today, again this morning, facing up to another fear to which I am no stranger, the fear of helplessness, the fear of things being out of control. But I happen to know I'm not alone. That there are a number of you out there that are nodding your heads either openly or inside. And when the bills are coming in and you see no end in sight, when you feel boxed in at work and you can't quit and you can't run and you can't stand it, and you're not in control, or you've got children that are out of control and they're 12 years old, and you've got these, what do you got, 7 years now of teens ahead, and it's unbelievable. Or you're in the sandwich generation and you're squeezed between your children and your parents, or your body's breaking down and your stamina and your health is going, you're out of control there, wherever it may be, circumstances, you're pregnant, and it may be an unstable relationship. You're not in control, and every week is 1 week closer to that baby being born. What are you going to do? Well, let me say, first of all, the roots of this fear of helplessness go all the way back to the beginning. If you take your Bible and you go back to Genesis, the first chapter, to creation, and God creates man and woman, male and female, because this is both a male and a female struggle. And it says, the 28th verse, God blessed them, and God said to them, be fruitful and increase in number, fill the earth and subdue it, have dominion over it. Rule over the fish of the sea and the birds of the air, and over every living creature that moves on the ground. First thing that God says to man and woman as he has created to them is, you are to have dominion. So I really don't need to make any apology for the fact that I long to be in control. That's the way God made me, and it's part of my essential design. It's not bad. It's bad when it gets out of control. But it's the way God designed us, to have things in control. He did not design us to be jellyfish carried by the currents in the water. He designed us to be more like sharks who determine where they're going and are in control. This is his plan. You go to the second chapter, however, and the next conversation God has with man is to talk about what he can eat. You're free to eat from any tree in the garden, but you must not eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Again, he emphasizes his control. You can eat whatever tree you want. However, that control is limited. There are limits on your authority. And it's the reaction of the desire to control against the fact that God has established limits that becomes the root of the first sin. Satan comes along and he says to Eve, if you will eat this fruit, you will be like God and you can have absolute control. You were made for dominion. God knows he made you that way. Eat the fruit and then your dominion will be unlimited. She eats the fruit. Adam eats it. Sin comes into the world. The order of creation is broken. And suddenly we are left with the longing to control in a broken world where we cannot control and in conflict with each other over who's going to be in control. And it's a mess. And it is this whole struggle and this whole mess that Jesus Christ came into the world. And I point to the cross behind me, that Jesus Christ came into the world to bring about reconciliation and peace and order again. Salvation has to do with the restoration of order in a broken world. Well, so what do I do now? What's the answer? Is it simply, do the best you can, but reconcile yourself to the fact that it just won't work? And ultimately, the runaway forces of life are going to win. You're going to die. That's out of control. You're going to die. You go back to dust. That's out of control. The writer of the book of Ecclesiastes says, life's a bummer. When I surveyed all that my hands had done and what I had toiled to achieve, everything was meaningless, chasing after the wind, and nothing was gained under the sun. Now, before you give up to the loss of control, before you give up to helplessness, turn back to this story now in Acts 27, because this is a crackerjack of a story. Pastor Dave read it to you. It really starts earlier in the 20th chapter of Acts, where Paul wants to go back to Jerusalem. The missionary Paul wants to go back to Jerusalem and back there to minister again. But the Jews in Jerusalem are totally hostile to him. He's warned against going. There's a prophetic announcement that if he goes, he's going to become a captive to the Jews. But he goes anyway. Goes to Jerusalem, goes into the temple, is falsely accused of breaking the temple regulations and dishonoring the temple and desecrating the temple. He's seized from the mob by Roman soldiers and taken to the lockup. There's a plot to storm the prison or when Paul is being moved from prison to courtroom to attack him. The word gets to Paul. Paul gets the word back to the centurion in charge. And in the night, they put together a military convoy. And they take him from Jerusalem in the center of Israel over to Caesarea up on the northeast shore of the land of Israel. Much more secure place for him. There, he will stand, he'll have hearings before Festus and Felix and Agrippa. And as Paul gives his testimony in those courtrooms, he becomes convinced that he'll get no justice there, and he won't. They'll hold him until they're hoping somebody will come up with some money. He knows he's not going to get justice. And so he does what, as a Roman citizen, he has the right to do. He says, I appeal to Caesar's court in Rome. He has the right to do it. Agrippa says, all right, then you will go to Rome. They gather a group of prisoners, some like Paul who are going for appeal cases, others who are condemned felons who are going to be shipped to Rome to be meat for the arena, to go and to die in the arena. A great way to accomplish two things. You execute your prisoners and you put on a show for the public. So some of them are condemned men going to Rome to die. A few are like Paul. The centurion's name is Julius. Good man. And he arranges for transportation on a ship that's a coasting vessel that's going north up the shore of Israel, Lebanon, on up to Turkey, and then across southern Turkey to a port called Myra. And there at Myra, they wait, they find an Alexandrian grain ship. These were the largest ships that plied the Mediterranean. Might have been as big as an 850-ton vessel, 180 feet long, 45-foot beam, 40-foot depth. And they were to the Roman economy what the oil tankers are to American economy. So there's an Alexandrian grain ship. Julius brings his group of prisoners and some soldiers on board, and they set sail again. These ships, however, are clumsy. They're nothing like our American clipper ships. None of the maneuverability of the modern sailing vessel. And they have almost no facility for sailing into the wind, and the prevailing winds are from the northeast. They've got to go in that direction because they're headed west. They beat their way gradually along the coast of Turkey. It takes a long time. They turn south and catch the winds down to Cyprus. By this time, it is late. It's into the fall. From the 10th of November till the 11th of March, there was no shipping whatsoever on the Mediterranean Sea. So, and the text will say that it was after the fast, that is after Yom Kippur, so it's getting into October. They worked their way down to Cyprus, they worked their way around Cyprus, and then along the south shore, along the south shore of Crete, and they come to a little harbor called Fair Havens. Would have been an adequate place to winter, but not the ideal place. Paul says, you better stay. This is at somewhere around the 10th, 11th verse. Paul stands up and says, you better stay here. I think they figured, well, what Paul's doing is dragging his feet. He doesn't want to get to Rome. Figures he'd get one more good winter at least down there in Crete. And so they overrule his judgment. And when they said, look, as soon as we get a good breeze, we'll go on to Phoenix, which is a little further west, and then winter there. Now, that brings you to where the scripture started. 13th chapter, the 13th verse of the 27th chapter, there's a nice breeze that comes up from the south. So they say, okay, we can take off. And they get out into the Mediterranean, and then suddenly the winds change. And now it's from the northeast again. And they find themselves in the midst of an horrendous storm which will go on for some 2 weeks, day and night, day and night. And I wish I had the ability to describe it or could paint the picture for you. How many of you have ever been in a storm on the ocean? Just raise your hand. Well, those of you who have know a little bit what this would have felt like. But remember, we're talking about a ship with no power for motivation aside from the sails, a very primitive style of sailing ship, built by no means with the quality of the ships that we built on our Maine coasts with our good Maine pine. And so the ship is driven out into the Mediterranean. They have no means of navigation, no compass, nothing to tell what direction they're going. They are utterly at the mercy of the wind. Night and day, the winds howl, the ship is tossed, it's leaking, they're anticipating it's going to go down. They cut off the rigging, they cut the big spar that holds the bottom of the mainsail, they dump everything they can to make the ship as seaworthy as possible, to remove all the weight that they can from the top and keep the center of gravity as low as possible. And they're caught in this storm. Paul's a prisoner, he's in the midst of a storm. There he is, out there in the Mediterranean. The 20th verse, Luke will say, because he's with him, we finally gave up all hope of being saved. They run ropes around the ship to try to tie it together. Typical thing, they have a sea anchor out. They're simply drifting with the wind, life out of control. And Paul takes charge. 21st verse. After the men had gone a long time without food, Paul stood up before them and said, "Men, you should have taken my advice not to sail from Crete." He rubs the noses in it just a little bit. But at the same time, he wants to establish his authority. "Then you would have spared yourself this damage and loss. But now I urge you, keep up your courage. Because not one of you will be lost. Only the ship is doomed. Only the ship will be destroyed. Last night, an angel of God, whose I am, whom I serve, stood beside me. Don't be afraid, Paul. You must stand trial before Caesar." Now, this is not taking place in some beautiful sunny place where Paul's preaching, or some comfortable place like this. You're in the stinking forecastle of a creaking ship, tossed in the wind. There's puke all over the floor. The place smells. They haven't been able to eat. They are sick. They are battered. They're hopeless. And Paul is standing there in front of them saying, "I want to tell you, last night an angel came to me and told me that we are all going to be spared." Then he goes on, "Don't be afraid, Paul. You must stand trial before Caesar. God has graciously given you the lives of all who sail with you. So keep up your courage, men. For I have faith in God that it will happen just as he told me. Nevertheless, we must run aground on some island." What you've got here is the fact that chains don't eliminate choices. Paul is a captive of Rome, has no physical liberty whatsoever. He is on a ship that is as helpless as any vessel could possibly be, in the midst of a storm that gives no hope of ending. But here's a man who in 1 Corinthians 6, the 12th verse says, "I will not be mastered by anything." That's a great verse. I refuse to be a slave to my circumstances or my temptations or to you, even though he must serve them as a felon. Well, the story goes on, the 27th verse. 14th night, we were still being driven across the Adriatic. About midnight, the sailors sensed they were approaching land. They hear the breakers begin to break, and this cowardly sailors they think only of their skins as a lifeboat that they've been towing behind, and so they're going to climb down the lifeboat and take off. But Paul says, "Don't let them go. They're deserting us. They're not going out there to put in anchors." So the soldiers slash the ropes on the boat, and the boat drifts away, and they're stuck there. Then Paul, 33rd verse, just before dawn, Paul urged them all to eat. "For the last 14 days," he said, "you've been in constant suspense and have gone without food. You've had nothing to eat. Now, let's have a picnic." And he breaks bread before them. Why am I walking you through all this? Because the pattern is here. In a broken world, chains don't eliminate choices. And I can still choose how I'm going to respond to what's going on about me. I have several illustrations I'd love to give you, but time runs away from me. Let me just give you one. On the 16th of January, 1994, a group of guerrillas in Columbia, South Carolina, overran a mission school, New Tribes Mission. And after abusing the people, threatening their lives, they took two of the men, Steve Welch and Tim Van Dyke, both of them married fathers, one with 4 children, one with 3 children, took them captive. And for the last year and a half, those two men have been in the hands of these Colombian guerrillas. And we've prayed for them here in this church, again and again, and all across the nation. On the 19th of June, there was a firefight between the guerrillas and the Colombian army, and somehow in the course of that fight, Steve Welch and Tim Van Dyke were killed, shot. Their bodies were buried in shallow graves. It was discovered and reported. And they had a memorial service out in North Platte, Nebraska, for Steve Welch. His brother led the service. And his brother in that service stood up and said, "There's something I need to correct. I must correct what was written in the newspaper. Steve was a volunteer. He was not a victim." That's a great distinction. He was not a victim. He was a volunteer. Paul is not a victim. Paul is a volunteer. He was a volunteer who had counted the cost and was there by choice. Chains don't eliminate choices. I said that to Carol Haynes up in Maine Medical Center on Friday night as I visited with her in the hospital. And she's right. And she's recognized it. She may have chains that physically are binding her body, but they don't eliminate choices. You can still choose how you're going to respond. Circumstances may be out of control, but your soul is not and need never be. The most important decisions are still in your court and in my court, regardless of what the circumstances are. And that's the lesson of this 27th chapter of Acts. Real freedom is a function of faith. Look at the 23rd verse here again. Paul standing up and saying, "Last night, an angel of the God whose I am and whom I serve stood beside me, gave me this message." 25th verse, "I have faith in God. It will be just as he told me. Nevertheless, we're going to have to run aground on some island." He doesn't know what island. He doesn't know how they're going to get ashore. But he does believe God. Faith defines his identity, whose I am. And this is what makes all the difference. If you belong to Jesus Christ, you're his. You belong to him. Whose I am and whom I serve. And that makes all the difference for Paul. God's in control, not Julius, though he's a good friend of Paul's, the centurion. Not Caesar, not the captain, not the sailors, not the soldiers. 14 days they've been adrift. There's a British yachtsman who did some great studies on this chapter and studied the charts, studied the wind strength, studied the drift of the wind, and plotted exactly where a boat would travel as this one traveled. And sure enough, it comes right to that same place that is now called St. Paul's Bay on Malta. And he plotted the time and found that indeed it would take you 13 and a half days to midnight of the 14th day to get to that shore based upon the charts of the speed of the wind and the storm. And that's where they were, at midnight. And God was in control. Now, later, Paul gets to Rome, and he'll turn around and he'll write the letter of Philippians from the jail in Rome. And he will write this verse, which is one of my life verses, Philippians 1:6. "Being confident of this, that he who began a good work in you will carry it on to completion until the day of Christ Jesus." You have to understand the roots of this. It's not out of control because God's in control. The 7th verse, "Whether I'm in chains or defending and confirming the gospel, all of you share in God's grace with me." Because he's in control. The 12th verse, Philippians 1. "Now I want you to know, brothers, that what's happened to me has really served to advance the gospel." The 19th verse, "What has happened to me will turn out for my deliverance. I am not helpless. I'm not out of control. The boat may be headed for the rocks and the rudder may be lashed and I may have no ability to steer, but God can. And I can still control my relationship with him." Now there's the theory. Now I will still struggle to make that theory a reality in the practice of my life. And I tell you that, and you know that. But there's the theory. God's in control, and I believe it. And God has given me a purpose, and nothing can obstruct it. And he who has begun a good work in you will perform it. I got to quit. Let me just close with this illustration. When we came here to Portland 6.5 years ago, I have friends across the country and churches, and we, people, pastors are always talking with each other, and they always said, how are things going? And they were soon saying to me, well, Bob, how are things going in Portland? And I said, well, I'll tell you, I feel like the captain of a toboggan. Now, some of you, how many of you have ridden on toboggans? Let's see hands. Yeah, okay, most Mainers have ridden on a toboggan at some time. To what extent can you steer a toboggan? Not very much. Not very much. I said, I feel like the captain of a toboggan. I'm sitting up there, I'm hanging on, we're having a wild ride. And I wish I could steer, but, we're having a wonderful time. Well, that's the way it felt, and has felt. And it's been exciting. Scary. Can't steer. Hang on. Let's go. It does remind me of 30 years ago when we were in Des Moines, and we went tobogganing with a Sunday school class of young couples. And they elected me captain of the toboggan that night. And we were tobogganing in a park in Des Moines. And so the park department, wanting to be helpful, had marked out the toboggan course with hay bales. Well, that's great, except that when you get freezing rain and the hay bales freeze and then they freeze down, they might just as well be blocks of granite. So I am elected, captain, so I get to sit in the front. I got 800 pounds of Sunday school class sitting behind me and an icy course, and we take off. Except, thank God, just before we took off, I thought, I just don't like this. And I pulled my legs out that were tucked in underneath, the round part of the toboggan, and I stuck them up over the front. So I was sort of like, legs up here, rest of the body up here, resting on, what down here. And we took off down the slope. It was wonderful. It was exciting, except down at the bottom, we hit square into one of those frozen blocks, those hay bales. And I crashed the front out of that toboggan with the backs of my legs. And I tell you, I thank God ever since that he whispered to me, get your legs out. And, or I might never have walked again. But he was still in charge. He was still in charge. And you may not think you can steer the toboggan, but he is in control. Thank him. Trust him. Believe him. Whose I am and whom I serve. And we are not victims. We are volunteers. And I don't need to fear the loss of control because he is in control. Whose I am and whom I serve. But be sure that you can say what Paul said. There's something so significant about Paul standing there. It must be about the 33rd verse where Paul says, you got to eat something. And after he said this, he took some bread and gave thanks to God in front of them all, and then he broke it. What do you think he was thinking about? When he takes bread, gives thanks, and breaks it in front of them all. He had to be thinking of what we do, of the Lord's table. He gives thanks. He breaks the bread in front of them all. And there he is in the stinking forecastle of a sinking ship, eating the bread and giving thanks before them all, recognizing that his master gave himself for Paul. And Paul says, if he would do that for me, then there is nothing. Being confident of this very thing, that he who has begun a good work in you will perform it until the day of Jesus Christ. So I'm not a victim. I am a volunteer. I hope you can say the same thing. And it begins with that relationship with Jesus Christ, and then it's built in that walk with Jesus Christ. And I am not in control, but he is. And I can't steer the toboggan, but he will. And I can trust him. There's an old hymn that was written by Ira Sankey back in the days of D.L. Moody, when Sankey was Moody's song leader. And it's 117 in your songbook. And turn to it, if you will. And we'll turn back the pages a century and sing at a Moody revival meeting.